Tory austerity.
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 This is the fundamental debate in this country and across Europe.
Austerity, a buzzword for much of the last 7 years that you're probably very sick of hearing about, may be over.
Is austerity really over? And should it be?
Reports suggest Theresa May and the Conservatives have interpreted their general election catastrophe as a public rejection of further spending cuts.
Austerity is over, May tells the Tories.
We're not deaf. We heard a message last week in the general election.
It's my intention to tender my resignation to the Queen.
We're all...
In the wake of the global financial crisis and the UK's biggest recession since the Second World War, the UK's deficit, the gap between its total revenue and total spending, spiked to 10% of GDP. In response, in 2010, the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, unveiled £110 billion worth of so-called fiscal austerity, that is, cuts in public spending and also increases in taxes. This was austerity, and it was part of an ambitious 5-year plan to wipe out the deficit entirely. This included deep cuts to welfare spending.
Welfare bills are coming down.
The cancellation of a host of school buildings programmes.
It's a tough economic situation out there.
Savage cuts to council funding.
Cuts of up to 10%.
And also an increase in VAT to 20%.
There's positive news today, which is the economy is growing.
The economy was initially expected to perform rather well during this period. However, growth flatlined, the economy teetered on the verge of another recession in 2011 and 2012, and unemployment rose.
Now unemployment is rising and growth has stalled.
Now in a recession, the Bank of England normally cuts interest rates to encourage people to spend, to stimulate growth. But at this stage, interest rates were already as low as they could go, meaning that it was impossible to rely on the Bank of England to perform this normal role of resuscitating the economy.
Austerity really does contract the economy.
Many economists had warned Osborne not to cut so deeply and so swiftly. But Osborne refused, insisting that to loosen the purse strings in this way and adopt a Plan B would result in a Greek-style public finance meltdown for the UK, which was something few economists found very credible as a threat at all. Austerity, as practiced by Osborne, was essentially a political choice rather than an economic necessity. And the human costs have been huge. Homelessness has doubled since 2010, and the number of people relying on food banks is estimated to be about 500,000 a year.
The NHS is on its knees at the moment.
There is a humanitarian crisis now facing the NHS.
Though NHS spending has actually increased in real terms, it hasn't kept pace with demand. And one of the consequences is that people are dying in corridors on NHS trolleys.
20 trolleys stacked up. This is going back to the dark ages.
Local councils have had their budgets cut by an average of 40%, resulting in closures of local libraries and domestic violence refuges.
We had to lose our jobs, our libraries. He has stripped us of everything.
Social care for the frail elderly is considered to be at breaking point. Public sector workers in the NHS, schools, prisons have seen their real terms pay go nowhere over 7 years.
This country hasn't had a pay rise for 10 years.
And unsurprisingly, morale is very low. Planned welfare cuts to tax credits are set to fall over the next 5 years, most heavily on the shoulders of the working poor, the very people the government says that it wants to help the most. And an estimated 80% of the burden of cuts so far has fallen on the shoulders of women. Despite the recent admission by the new Chancellor, Philip Hammond, that people are weary of recession, he still insists that the government will balance the overall budget by the middle of the next decade. If the government did successfully wipe out the deficit, it would entail more spending cuts, more tax hikes, more restraint on public sector pay rises, and all at a time when living standards are already under pressure.
I can hardly afford the bills I've got to do, and you're going to take more from me.
The deficit today is already pretty modest by historic standards, standing at around 3% of GDP. And there's no credible risk, really, to the solvency of the UK state. And even government ministers have actually given up making that particular spurious argument. The government is likely to come under increasing pressure to increase spending.
Resign! A quarter of kids are up in poverty and you're taking their free school meals. You should be ashamed of yourself.
And the mood music from Whitehall suggests that government ministers, terrified by the prospect of a Labour government coming in to take over, are not particularly inclined to resist it. Austerity, defined as a conservative political project to shrink the size of the state, probably is over. But sadly, given Brexit and the continued structural strain on public spending due to an ageing population,
we're about to get considerably more worse off.
The economic pain for the British public almost certainly is not over.